Alcides Ghiggia is running down the right touchline with the ball, and he has already done this once. 11 minutes ago, he came down the same strip of grass and pulled the ball back, and Juan Schiaffino put it away, and the score went to 1 apiece. Every Brazilian defender on the field knows it. The left back knows it. The goalkeeper knows it. 200,000 people packed into the stands know it. So, when Ghiggia arrives at the same corner of the field for the second time, the goalkeeper does the thing he has done successfully for 10 years. He takes one step off his near post to close the angle of the cross that is about to come. Ghiggia does not cross. He shoots, low and hard, through the gap that step has just opened. The ball goes in at the near post, and the largest stadium ever built goes silent inside a single second. The goalkeeper's name was Moacir Barbosa Nascimento. He was 29 years old. He was, by most accounts of that decade, the finest goalkeeper alive. And he had just made the sort of decision that goalkeepers make every weekend of every season without anyone remembering it by Monday. Brazil remembered it for 50 years. Here is the part that should bother you. The country did not spend 50 years talking about a goal. It spent 50 years talking about a man. Those are not the same thing. And the distance between them is the entire story. To understand what happened to Barbosa, you have to understand what that afternoon was supposed to be. It was the 16th of July, 1950. It was not technically a final. The 1950 World Cup ended with a group of 4 teams playing each other, and Brazil had gone into the last match needing only a draw. They had beaten Sweden 7-1. They had beaten Spain 6-1. They were playing at home, in a stadium the city had built specifically so this could happen in front of the largest crowd in the history of the sport. And the country had already started celebrating. The newspaper O Mundo printed a photograph of the Brazilian team that morning with a caption naming them world champions. 22 gold medals had been engraved with the names of the Brazilian players. The mayor of Rio de Janeiro gave a speech over the loudspeakers before kickoff, addressing the team as victors in front of everyone. What do you suppose that does to a group of men who still have 90 minutes to play? Jules Rimet, the president of FIFA, had written a short speech in Portuguese to read at the trophy presentation. He never read it. He later described walking down into a stadium where nobody was speaking, holding a trophy nobody wanted to look at, and handing it to the Uruguayan captain almost privately, as though passing something illegal. Ghiggia spent the rest of his life repeating a line about that silence, that only 3 people had ever managed to quiet the Maracanã, and he was one of them. So the defeat was not simply a defeat. It was a public event that had been pre-written as a coronation, and the country had to do something with the gap between the script and the result. This is where the story stops being about football. Because 11 Brazilians lost that match. 3 of them were put on trial. Barbosa, the goalkeeper. Bigode, the left half, who had been beaten by Ghiggia. Juvenal, the left back. Those 3 names became the answer to the question of what went wrong, and they stayed the answer for half a century. All 3 of them were black. This is not a coincidence anyone has to strain to find. It was written down at the time by the people in charge. João Lira Filho, the head of the Brazilian delegation, produced an official report on the failure. His explanation was not tactical. He argued that the team had lost because of what the Brazilian people were made of, that the country's racial mixture had produced players drawn to improvisation and display, rather than the discipline he saw in European sides. The head of the delegation explained a football result by explaining a nation's blood. You have to sit with how strange that is. A man moved one step off his post, and the official conclusion was about the composition of a population. But it was not strange in 1950, and that is the point. 3 years earlier, the journalist Mário Filho had published a book called The Negro in Brazilian Football, tracing how black players had been excluded, insulted, and then slowly grudgingly allowed into the game. When he revised that book after the World Cup, he recorded something bleak. The defeat had brought the old racism back into the open, refreshed. The tournament was supposed to be the proof that the new Brazil worked. A modern country, a monumental stadium, a mixed team, a trophy. When the proof failed, the theory did not get discarded. It got a defendant. So what actually happened on Ghiggia's goal? If you look at it as football, a winger repeated a move he had just used successfully. A goalkeeper, correctly anticipating the more dangerous option, stepped to cut off the cross. The shot went through the space he vacated. It was, at worst, a misread. The kind of misread that any goalkeeper who steps off his line will make several times a season. Paulo Perdigão, who reconstructed the match almost second by second in his book Anatomy of a Defeat, spent an entire volume demonstrating that the loss had many authors and one scapegoat. Perdigão was 11 years old on the day of the match, and he wrote the book 36 years later, which tells you something about how long that afternoon stayed inside people. And Barbosa? He kept playing. He was still Brazil's goalkeeper for another 3 years. He kept winning things with Vasco da Gama. The football world, the part of it that actually watched him work, never really believed he was the reason. The country did. The punishment was not a single dramatic act. It was slow, and it was made of thousands of small ones, which is what makes it worth understanding. Strangers recognized him in the street and told him what he had done. Mothers pointed him out to children. He said, decades later, that the worst moment of his life was hearing a woman in a shop tell her son, "Look, there is the man who made all of Brazil cry." Do you know what he was doing for money by then? He had a job as a caretaker at the Maracanã. There is a story from those years that Brazilians still tell. When the stadium's wooden goalposts were replaced, Barbosa is said to have taken them home and burned them in a barbecue in his backyard. It is a perfect story. And like a lot of perfect stories, its details wobble when you press them. The dates people give do not always match when those posts actually came out, and there are competing accounts of where the wood ended up. But he told a version of it himself, and you can see why he would. It was the only sentence in the whole affair that he got to write. Then there is 1993, which is the story that made him a legend of a different kind. Brazil were preparing at Granja Comary for a decisive World Cup qualifier against Uruguay, of all opponents. Barbosa came to the training camp. A British television crew wanted him to record an interview with Taffarel, the goalkeeper of that generation. The interview never happened. The press reported that he had been turned away because the staff feared he would bring bad luck. Carlos Alberto Pereira, the coach, later said plainly that he had banned it, that he did not want contact with Barbosa or any player of the past, that it added nothing. And yet, Barbosa's adopted daughter, Teresa, has insisted for years that the cruelest version is false, that Zagallo received him, and that the advice not to pose for photographs with the goalkeepers came from a worry that the press would turn the images into a cursed story and hang the next failure around his neck too. Stop and look at what that means. The most repeated anecdote about the man's exile may itself be a piece of folklore the country improved on. Even the story of how Brazil rejected Barbosa got told in the way that made the best legend. 43 years after the goal, he was still not being treated as a person who had been there. He was being treated as an omen, and the machinery kept running after him. In 1966, Brazil went to England with a black goalkeeper named Manga, who made an error against Hungary and was buried under the same kind of avalanche, with the same speed, and never played for the national team again. The country did not have to reinvent the mechanism. It already had one. In his last years living in Praia Grande on the coast of São Paulo, Barbosa said the line that is now quoted more often than his name. In Brazil, the maximum prison sentence is 30 years. He had been paying for 50 for a crime he did not commit. He died on the 7th of April, 2000, after a stroke. He was 79, and he was poor. Count the days from his death to the 50th anniversary of the goal, and you get 100. He missed the moment when the whole country would finally talk about him for a week by 100 days. Now, the part almost nobody connects. Brazil did erase something from that afternoon. Not the goal. The shirt. The team that lost in 1950 played in white. And after the defeat, the white shirt was treated as tainted, unpatriotic, unlucky. So, in 1953, a newspaper ran a national competition to design a new one, with a single rule. It had to use all 4 colors of the flag. The winner was an 18-year-old from a town on the Uruguayan border, Aldir Garcia Schlee, who drew more than 300 versions before he arrived at a yellow shirt, blue shorts, white socks. Schlee grew up on the frontier, in a place where the line between the two countries runs down the middle of ordinary life. He supported Uruguay. The most recognizable shirt in the history of the sport, the yellow that now means Brazil to every person on earth, was designed by a teenager who had been rooting for the other team on the day that made it necessary. That is what Brazil did with 1950. It changed its skin. It threw out the white, adopted the yellow, went to Sweden in 1958, and won so often afterwards that the yellow became a symbol of joy, rather than of the thing it was invented to cover. 5 years to replace a shirt, 50 to reconsider a man. Because a shirt can be redesigned by a boy with a pencil, and a verdict cannot. Once a country has decided that a loss has a face, that face has to keep being wrong, or everyone else has to be a little bit guilty instead. Nelson Rodrigues, the playwright, would later give Brazil the phrase for its own self-image after that day. The mongrel complex, the conviction that Brazilians are inferior when it matters. He was describing a country that had found it easier to believe in a curse than in a bad afternoon. You already know this mechanism even if your country has never lost a World Cup final. Something goes wrong in a group, a team, a company, a family, and within days there is a name attached to it, and the name is almost never the person with the most power. It is usually the person standing closest to the visible moment. The goalkeeper is standing behind everyone else, in a different colored shirt, at the exact instant the ball crosses the line. He is the easiest thing in the frame to point at. Barbosa took one step to his left in the 79th minute of a football match, and a nation that had already printed the medals decided that was where its disappointment lived. He was right about the arithmetic. 30 years is the sentence. He served 50 and then 100 days.